Thanks, Nicola. So my name's Tom Walters. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. I do work with a variety of different companies, but I spend my day looking after kids with IBD. So after tonight, we're going to go through getting a sense as to how much IBD there is in Canada, how it's increasing, what it really means, a little bit of geeky stuff as to how the whole thing works. I think understanding stuff helps you really appreciate it, and then really focus in on what it is that becomes important when we're looking after kids with IBD. So IBD, inflammation or inflammatory bowel disease. Inflammation, simply Latin for red, sore and swollen. It's become a real big buzzword. IBD, UC, ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, IBDU. Why is it there, and why will we spend tonight in the middle of this cold evening coming out to talk about pediatrics? Why now? Why here? Well, Canada is this little hotbed of pediatric IBD. Okay, it's been increasing. We counted it this year. It looks like probably about 100 in every 100,000 kids in Canada have IBD. If we look out to 2030, that's going to increase to about 160, so rapidly increasing. If you look over the last 20 years, it's almost doubled, to the extent that we've now got a whole group across Canada where we bring together all the different pediatric groups looking after IBD, and we try and understand it better. And we brought it together and we call it Kids Can, because kids can get better. So what's IBD like? Hands up anyone who has IBD or knows someone with IBD. Cool, this is what 1 in 1,000 does to us, hey? So UC, ulcerative colitis, is sort of easy. You got blood in your poop. This is what UC does. Crohn's is a little bit trickier, but in general, you got bellyache, maybe with diarrhea, maybe without eating, maybe with some weight loss, but generally tummy ache is what characterizes Crohn's disease. The thing with Crohn's disease is it can hide on the inside. It can be something happening that really doesn't even seem to relate to your intestine. It can be how you're growing. You can get fevers, you can get anemia, all these things you wouldn't think were because you've got a problem in your intestine. About 80% of people are classic, 20% are not, which means IBD, it can be a silent disease. It's a hidden disease. You look at someone with IBD, you've got no idea they've got it. And this is why it becomes such a challenge. So in the words of Michael Gillen, where did it come from? Great TV show. I'm a geek. I like, knowing where things come from. So tonight, it's going to be a little bit like going back to school. Okay, we're going to learn stuff. And so we're going to learn little models. So why does IBD happen? Well, obviously it's got something to do with the lining of our intestine, which we call the mucosa. And it's all about, everything's to do with genetics, so it's got something to do with genetics. And then it's about the stuff around us, the environment, particularly that thing called the microbiome. And when all of those four things come together, and they sometimes end up in inflammation, and that's the time where we get IBD. So we're going to go through each of these. And firstly, let's learn about inflammation. We're going to do Inflammation 101. Okay, so what's inflammation? Well, the body, it releases various chemicals. We're going to call those chemicals cytokines. And now these cytokines, they can increase inflammation or they can decrease inflammation, be anti-inflammatory. So a cell makes these, but how on earth does a cell know that it's got to make cytokines? So remember back in biology, you draw a cell, you had to do double walls and a little circle, that's a nucleus, like the factory of the body. Well, imagine along comes the world, insult, injury, irritation, and it hits the cell. The cell makes a few chemicals which make you a bit upset, but on the inside it does this communication system to the nucleus, and the nucleus goes and makes these pro-inflammatory cytokines, so those chemicals of inflammation. They go off to the body and they call in the inflammatory cells. So inflammation, your body doesn't bother doing stuff unless you need it. Hey, inflammation's good for killing off infections. It's the #1 reason we've got it. In IBD, these cytokines of inflammation, they get all out of balance. And we end up getting inflammation when it doesn't seem to be fighting something that's useful. So let's think about that. We've all got a tummy. We've all had a bad day. Hey, your gut gets really sore, but then it gets better. That's the usual thing that's meant to happen. In IBD, it gets sore, but it doesn't get better. It just keeps on being sore. Maybe eventually it finally settles itself down. And it's trying to understand why that difference happens. And so let's think about another model. You've got the world, and then you've got your body. And the only thing protecting you is your intestinal mucosa, a little line of cells in your intestine, and they are there to keep the world out. So underneath, we've got all those cytokines. And the cytokines, I said, they go and get all these cells. We call them the effector cells, which are the ones that make inflammation. And then we call them the suppressor cells, the ones that try and calm down inflammation. So something comes along and you get sore, so your effector cells come in, but then the cavalry comes in and the suppressor cells come in, and you feel good again. That's what's meant to happen. Well, in IBD, it all goes wrong, doesn't it? Something happens, those cytokines come along, the effector cells come in, and it just keeps on happening. And a little bit depending on who you are, one sort of cell might happen and it looks like ulcerative colitis, or another set of cells might happen and it looks like Crohn's disease. The basic problem in inflammation is that we have an overstimulation or overreaction of the mucosal immune system giving us IBD. Now that might be because there's too much stimulus, it might be because there's too much response, or it might be that we have too little of that off switch trying to get ourselves better. The trigger, the mechanism, probably for everyone is that little bit different, which is why everyone's IBD is not quite like the other person's IBD, and different things work to either make you worse or to make you better. So what could be so stimulating? What could get the gut going? Okay, well, let's talk about the microbiome. That's what was on the advertising. And honestly, if you get to be on the cover of The Economist, you must be big and famous. So the microbiome is really important. You're going to hear a lot about that tonight. When we think about IBD in bugs, it would be nice if there was just one bug, like an infection, which gave it to you. And it's really attractive, but there is absolutely no proof that this is the problem, okay? It's more so that we have to think of our microbiome like we think about ecosystems at school, okay? That the ecosystem has to be balanced. And in IBD, it's become unbalanced. We talked about this thing called the dysbiosis. And maybe you've got more of the bad bugs, maybe you haven't got enough of the good bugs, or maybe it's just really boring. Okay, there's just not enough variation. You know, life is full of variation. Variation is good. Maybe the problem actually is that you've got a very normal bacteria, but your body is responding to it in an abnormal way. And so trying to understand bugs and IBD, while there's lots of evidence, becomes a bit confusing because there's all these different bits of messaging, all of which seem to be true for some people. So what makes us all different? The genetics. Our genetics are different. Our genetics are our codes that make us be who we are. So let's understand genetics. We're going to do genetics 101. So it's easy. You've got chromosomes. They come in pairs. You've got 22 of them, plus an extra pair, which sometimes look a little bit different. On a chromosome, you've got genes, okay? Not as many as we thought, only about 30,000, so it should be easy to work all of that genetic stuff out. Now, genes code for proteins. Proteins rule the world. Easy. Just remember that, and your whole genetic knowledge is perfect. Now, of course, genes may be different. I said diversity. Diversity is a good thing. Genes may go wrong. Not such a good thing. Okay, proteins rule the world. What do I mean? Well, proteins run all of your body processes. If a body process goes wrong, we call that disease. Genes code for proteins. So, if the gene codes for maybe a little protein, your body process isn't going to work, your body process is broken, you get disease. It may be it codes for too much protein. Body process doesn't work, you get disease. Maybe it codes for the wrong sort of protein and it looks all sort of funny. Body process doesn't work, you're going to get disease. It all comes down to proteins rule the world. So what do we know about genes and what proteins they make for us? Well, there's this really cool magazine called Nature. If you're a scientist and you're in Nature, you have like made it. And this was a really cool one back in 2001. This is when I started in the area of genetics on IBD. And they found this thing. They wrote 2 little letters, go figure. You can become famous writing a little letter in a little magazine. But they'd found this thing and they called it NOD2, the gene. Now, They said they found it, but obviously genes have been around for like 80,000 years. Hey? I mean, this NOD2 has been doing normal stuff for a long time, and it's involved with looking at bacteria and helping that message go through, that messaging we said that goes to the nucleus. What they had really found was that there were 3 abnormalities of that gene which accounted for about 30% of people with Crohn's disease. That was really exciting. So if we think about it, we had that little way of injury, irritation, things to the cell. Well, what if those are microbes? Well, if the genetics say that you've got this NOD2 and you don't deal with microbes right, maybe that explains why the microbes end up giving you inflammation. Cool, so that's 30%. So we've only got 2 more findings to go and we'll understand the whole of genetics. So we looked at the whole genome to see what was associated. We found this thing called IL-23R. So that's a cytokine. You remember those chemicals of inflammation? So microbes upset it, and maybe the way you make your inflammatory cytokines has gone wrong. And maybe that's why the genetics and the microbes join together. That's great. We then found ATG16 like 1. ATG16 is like a housekeeping gene. It goes off, and if you've got all this grunge and stuff in the cell, it cleans it all up. Well, that makes sense. So maybe a bug gets into the cell and stays in there, and unless we clean it up, it's going to keep stimulating and give you an inflammatory response. Great. So that's 3 genes. So we should have fixed it, really, hey? Yeah, we've explained about 20% of IBD. We now, 20 years later, have found 200 more genes, and we still really don't understand it. Some genes become really simple, okay? There are some things in your body that if they don't work, you get really bad inflammation. One of those is this thing called IL-10. IL-10 is the turner-offer of inflammation. If your body doesn't make that, you get really bad inflammation, and some people that looks like IBD. It'll happen when you're a baby. And we call that monogenic disease, one gene disease. It's sort of simple. It's bad if you've got it, but it's simple to understand. Now, life is not always so simple, and I said that the mucosa protected you against the world, hey? Well, there's this one gene called C10R106. It's like a really simple one. And it looks at your epithelial integrity. So what stops bugs coming through the cells or between the cells are this little protein called E-cadherin. So E-cadherin, you don't have to remember the name, but it's what stops you leaking around in this area. Okay, well, we saw that this gene was associated with IBD, so how did it work? It didn't seem to be directly on any of those cytokines. Well, it led to an increase in one protein, which then led to an increase in another protein, which then led to a decrease in the E-cadherin protein, which meant you stop being so tightly joined. It means bugs could get in. Well, maybe bugs are okay to get in for some people and not other people. So maybe it depends on changing your microbes. And so we see that maybe this gene, when you have change in microbes, may now lead to IBD. And so we talk then about complex disease. And IBD in genetics is a complex disease. It's not a simple 1 or 2 gene thing, 200 genes down the road, and truly we still don't quite understand how it works. But it's fascinating. So what do we do? Well, I'm a doctor. We treat it. So again, it's a bit of a buzzword. We talk about, how do we get you better? And so we have targets of treatment. And me as a doctor, well, I want you to feel better. I want your lab tests to be better. I want your endoscopy to be better. But how about if you're a patient? What do you want to be? Well, most of the kids in my clinic, they just want to be normal. They don't care about all the other stuff. It means I'm normal, I'm happy. So for the last couple of minutes, let's think about being normal. So normal's a spectrum. But it's a spectrum that people really like being on because there's a bit of this and a bit of that. And so if you're a kid, you haven't got all that many things to do in life, really, have you? You've got to grow up and grow old. So let's think about what IBD does to those 2 things. And let's think about how we might be able to change that experience of growing up and growing old. So why would you grow? Well, your brain, it makes this stuff called growth hormone. It goes to your bones, but it doesn't do a lot there, but it goes to your liver. You make this other chemical, we call it IGF-1, and that's what makes your bones big and strong. It makes them tall, it makes them strong, and you need IGF-1 to grow and be healthy. So, as well as needing that, why else do you need to grow? Well, it's all about building blocks, hey? If you want to have strong bones, you've got to have calcium, you've got to have energy to make them, you've got to bang them around so that they know they have to get stronger, and you need the hormones that I just talked about. You can imagine that if you don't get all of those things, one of them may be missing, and your bones aren't going to be strong, they're not going to be tall. And when it comes to being tall, you have a growth spurt time. There's a period in your life when you're going to grow, and then once that's over, you're as tall as you're ever going to be. So the clock is ticking. The same thing happens to your bone strength. It's a bit later, about when you're 25, you stop making strong bones and they just start disintegrating. That's everybody, IBD, no IBD. So you've got until 25 to have the strongest bones possible. And so again, the clock is ticking and we have to think, how would IBD upset that? Well, there are 3 reasons. 2 are obvious. 1, you don't have enough energy, hey? You feel sore, you don't want to eat, you poop a lot, you don't absorb things so well, and you end up with not enough energy to grow. Number 2 is often we use steroids. And steroids have lots of things. Anyone who's had steroids knows it's awful. You get a big chunky face, you eat so much. But the other thing it does is it stops you growing. Remember all that process I said from the bone to the brain and all those things? Well, steroids block absolutely every process that helps you grow. And so while you're on steroids, you won't grow. So we try not to use steroids so much in kids because it's going to affect their growing. But there must be something else. It's such that no end of food, still some kids don't grow. And what is it? It's because those cytokines block that chemical I talked about called IGF-1. So just having inflammation will stop you growing and will stop you being able to make your bones strong. No amount of exercise, no amount of energy is going to get over that blockade. So what's going to make you tall? Well, your mum and dad are going to make you tall. How quickly you come and see me is going to make you tall, and I can't change either of those. But the period once we meet you and we control your inflammation is what's going to make you as tall as possible and your bones as strong as possible. So we have to be on top of it, and we have to think about treating inflammation well. Growing up and growing old and being happy. It's mandatory to grow old, somewhat optional to grow up. So you all got your little books, hey? You go through it very carefully. Yeah, they smiled. Yeah, they rolled. Yeah, they walked. Yeah, they talked. Yeah, they skipped. And now they've left home. Yeah, they got that little bit in between. Hey, all parents try to forget it, called adolescence. Adolescence is a hassle, hey? Because about the time a kid gets IBD is about the time you're trying to go through adolescence. And so, as an adolescent, any adolescent, you've got a to-do list, hey? You've got to be independent from your parents. You've got to work out who you are, what you want to be. But if you've got IBD, you've got to cope with all the IBD stuff as well. Okay, IBD, who wants to talk about pooping? Okay, who wants to mention to your mates that you can't go to the cinema because you're not sure if you're going to have to get up in the middle of it to go for a poop? None of this is cool. Okay, you go on steroids, you go on medicines, they make you look odd. It's no surprise that we have a lot of mental health and anxiety for kids with IBD who are trying to get through adolescence anyway. And so lots of these things are important. Inflammatory control is an important part of managing IBD, but there is more to inflammatory diseases than controlling inflammation. And so a few things to think about. And for friends you have or families you have is remember it takes a village to raise a kid. Support systems are really important. You should be there for people. You should know about these diseases. Orange is the New Black, cool TV show, huh? Well, for this family, IBD is the new norm. We can't ignore the fact that you have IBD, and we have to be there to support people through what this means, which means practical solutions. You've got to get on with life. Getting on with life means going to school, playing sport, working out how that can happen. It's important, however, to balance it. Too much activity, crash and burn. Too little activity, you just spiral into this inactivity and being depressed. So somewhere you have to balance it all up and come up with solutions, because I've got a few mantras in my clinic, and one of them is, everyone's got something, you got IBD, whatever, we'll deal with it, but you're normal and you got to do normal stuff. So doing normal stuff is part of IBD. And so what's our checklist for normality? Number 1, check you got the building blocks for growth. Energy, nutrients, activity, very important. Control inflammation. Near enough is not good enough. We have to have good control. Time matters, speed is of the essence. And remember the non-inflammatory. The inflammatory diseases are not just about having inflammation. So that's us quickly walking through IBD. There's a lot of it, it's coming up more, it's an important thing to look at, and you can see that in kids there are different things we have to think of besides inflammation. But people sometimes ask me, so what's IBD to me? Well, to me, this is IBD. Extraordinary kids just doing normal stuff. And if kids are doing normal things, then we're on top of IBD. Thanks for your attention.